Short enough to get your attention, but long enough to cover the important parts. I've never worn this particular miniskirt, so this is going to be a first time for me to try and get through this, but let's see how we go. So first off, this is great. Some of you, forgiveness, you've seen a couple of these slides before. But you know, I'm glad because I thought people would have stolen a lot of my thunder already about the popularity of FHIR, but already there have been references to, if you went to HIMSS, you would see headlines like this, you would see FHIR emblems everywhere. And of course, it's not just because of you know, the hype, it's because there's articles like this and real evidence that people are liberating data through the use of FHIR and other technologies. Got a couple builds here from previous slides. And it's not just like our healthcare IT journals and our own media, of course, it's also mainstream media picking up this. And that's because we're seeing real world applications also like this. So if anyone has seen Cerner's announcement about its API based on FHIR, or Epic's App Orchard, all right, and leveraging, I'm sure Dan will tell us a lot more about Smart on FHIR and some of the basic FHIR profiles behind that use throughout the US. They're helping people get access to data that's traditionally been locked up. And it's not just in the US. EMIS is one of the largest EMR providers in the UK, 50% of the market share there. And they, of course, announced that they, too, are going down very similar tracks, these similar trends that we're seeing all over the place, right? People trying to basically open up their applications, right, through APIs. And on the back end, what they're saying is the data model that you can expect the data to be available in is basically following FHIR. But for many of us, this leads to then the dilemma, the issue. So FHIR is wonderful, FHIR is great, yay, FHIR, more FHIR. When? How? What should I invest in? That's a lot of the conversations that we're talking to with people these days. And also then, so I've got existing apps or I've got existing interfaces. What do I do with those? So ultimately, what people are asking about then is, so what's the sort of the cost-benefit analysis? Usually then they have to add in some sort of time period to all of this, sort of what's my time horizon. And if where I thought we would be today is that we would have, just if you Googled cost savings of FHIR, you'd get like 1,000 hits instantly and all these case studies and uses and stuff like that. But the honest truth is you don't. Really. If anyone can prove me wrong, please tell me and tell me quickly, because we've been at this for quite a little while. And so you have to sort of unpack that a little bit. And so when people start thinking about just interface costs, and how do I even just attribute the cost to my interface over a period of time? Well, certainly I've got my sort of one-time sort of capital costs, and you kind of have to figure out, well, when I think about my capital costs, am I going to include hardware and middleware and all those other sorts of things? Or am I really just going to look at sort of the resourcing side of your traditional solution development lifecycle? And then I also need to include my operating costs over a period of time. And again, do I care about middleware patching and security patches and all that sort of stuff? Or is it really just about like bug fixes of the interfaces or onboarding new people who may have a new code that needs mapping, a new data element that they want added? But it's not just about the total cost of just the cost of the interface. Usually what people are after is sort of cost divided by n. They're sort of interested in what's my cost per connection point so that I can get a comparative number. And then immediately you go down the path of connection points and you kind of run into this problem, well, not all connection points are equal. So as in a great example in Ontario, let's take like the Connecting Ontario portal. That's one connection point, but represents literally thousands of users, right? It's really not the same as perhaps a single EMR instance in a doctor's office, right? So maybe you think about number of users as your N, but that also is problematic. We have all sorts of people using systems. We have delegates. If a person logged on once and used it once and sent one transaction, is that significant? Most people end up sort of then thinking about cost per transactions. And there's lots of interesting things you could probably do in that space if you particularly started looking at the transactions and the number of transactions from a particular connection point, and even what some of those costs per type of transaction. Because maybe the people who have a whole lot of error messages are the same people costing you a lot of money on your resourcing side on your operating costs. But of course, it's not just for the people, when you're talking total cost of ownership, it's not just the people with the interface, right? You've got to get now costs for all of your points of connection. And the next challenge that you run into there, of course, is we all know that every point of connection in every system that we're talking is designed differently, deployed differently, and has different amount of resourcing to support it. So think of even just a simple basic of the costs of making a change to a true cloud-based solution versus a local install, all right? And then you have to forecast your N, right? How many of these points of connection am I going to get to over a period of time? And again, once you throw in time into your calculations, well, these different deployments, their availabilities, all these other sorts of things start adding some complexity. But of course, it's never just about a single interface, right? Everyone's always interested in the scenario, right? So if I were to do a CDA-based exchange, what would my total cost be versus a FHIR-based exchange, just as two hypotheticals? And this is where, remember when I started off the discussion, I said, well, you've got to figure out sort of your cost side, of your capital costs and your operating costs, you've got to figure out which ones you want to account for. Well, it gets really important now at this stage in the game to have made sure that you took out all of the things that are common in either scenario, project management, legal sharing agreements, PIAs, TRAs, because you're going to have to try and find the data that's of interest to compare these two scenarios. And the other problem with these scenarios, of course, is that there's architecture implied. We can argue that. You can force these different standards and different approaches into other ways. But not only is there architecture implied, but there's usually reusable components, right? And the age-old example of, listen, in order to do this CDA-based exchange, we're expecting that in the SOAP header, we're going to have a SAML token, and that's going to have some important parameters that we're going to use for single sign-on. Oh, wait a second. On this other use case, though, we're talking FHIR, we're talking JSON, and we're talking RESTful, and now we can't necessarily reuse our identity access management solution. So we have to factor that cost of potential change into our other comparative model. And then it gets even more complex and interesting and fun when what a lot of people want to do is say, well, I've already got this V2 interface that's up and running. And that started about 10 years ago. Maybe let's use the OLIS example as one, right? And that's been running along. And now I'm interested in what would happen if at some point in the future I was also able to stand up a FHIR-based interface, have those two running in parallel, and onboard new people onto the FHIR-based interface, but then add into this the cost of deprecating my HL7 V2 interface and the cost of switching those people over to the new FHIR interface. And at this point, I started thinking to myself, the only thing more exciting than a presentation on standards is a presentation on standards and math. And maybe if we threw in some tax legislation or something like that, we could cure insomnia. But basically, it gets complex quickly, is what we have found out. And so you have all of these different scenarios, and you start working through them, and of course we're talking time and we're talking forecasting, and you start thinking through different adoption targets or rates. Oh, if I were to go through CDA, maybe I could only get 100 people to adopt this in the next 5 years. If I did FHIR, oh, it's fast, maybe I could get more people in the same amount of time, or the same total number of people in a shorter period of time. And then it's really hard when you're trying to compare, even if you're going back and comparing what's already done historically, if you just wanted to compare a CDA interface that was done somewhere and a V2, the data exchange, looking at whether or not you're just comparing the data contributors versus the data consumers, if the numbers people are giving you are like the all-in costs with, like I said, requirements gathering and use cases, which you'd have to do regardless of which standard you picked, or are they really able to get down to just like the development costs, the testing costs, and these sorts of things? It's really hard to get detailed historical data for just the data exchange portion of the design. Even when I talk with mobile app developers who have done stuff with FHIR, they quote me a number, and what they're usually quoting me is the development time for the entire app. And that's awesome, but I don't want the user exchange data in there. How much time did you spend trying to figure out, the exchange component with the FHIR-based API? And the other part of this is, so the cost side is complex, but the benefit side is even more complex, right? And the benefits that people really care about in healthcare aren't really generally just these small cost savings around an interface. They want, to see how this bigger initiative is helping contribute to at least one of the key aspects of the triple aim of care. So 5 minutes, perfect. So I've gone really fast, but that's okay. From terms of recommendations, if you are going to go down this path, from an interface perspective, I would argue that adoption is the key benefit. Don't worry about trying to demonstrate cost savings over time. Focus on adoption, because that has been our toughest thing, I think, on all of these EHR journeys. If what you can demonstrate is that one interface versus another will lower your mean time to adoption, right away you're removing risk, right? We all know about projects that had the funding, the perfect solution, got stood up, but because it took so long to onboard people, all of a sudden technologies change, political will, funding changes, and all of a sudden that's no longer the darling asset. We've got tons of risk with all of our initiatives. We can't do anything with FHIR about how long it takes legal to go through data sharing agreements. But we all have to do whatever we can to try and shrink that mean time to adoption. Or if you can even just get a higher total number of adopters in the same period of time, then how that interface in the broader system contributes to those other benefits, like improving the quality of care for an individual patient because a physician now has the data they need to make the decisions they want, then you've got a greater number of these total benefits. When going down this road, perfection is definitely the enemy of good enough. So there's a nuance to that, though, I would say. You really got to get your scenarios crisply defined, your comparative scenarios. You really have to tell people, and when you're trying to figure out what you're going to include in your cost and your benefit and how to strip that all out. But after that, once you've got your framework in place, what you're really dealing with is estimates, FTE counts, average salaries that those FTE counts might have, percentages of things, 15% faster. If I hear like 10 people could say 15% faster.
Oh, 15 times faster.
15 times faster, 15 times faster, 15 times faster, then over time, that works good enough for me. If you do check out the cost of an HL7 V2 interface, if you Google that, all right, and you go through forums and these clinician forums in the US, whatever, rightly or wrongly, for a one-way feed, you hear these doctors complaining that it often costs between $5,000 and $10,000. That's as statistically relevant as I can get without diving into it, but a one-way feed for a lab to an EMR, $10,000 is an often quoted number. And that's it. That is the world's most exciting presentation on standards and math, and now for tax legislation. So questions or comments? Anyone gone down this path and have lessons learned? Folks at the hospitals who have to do this? No? Yeah.
Just ask a developer.
Right. Absolutely. All right. Well, listen, if there aren't any questions or comments, one thing I will do is I'll take this as an opportunity to encourage folks to get engaged. If not you yourself, take this back and tell your staff. In particular, in Canada, we have the FHIR Implementers Working Group, hosted by Canada Health Infoway. We are doing amazing work in this group. You have got to come and see the tooling work. It's mind-blowing, taking you from clinical requirements and use cases through to implementation guide, profiling, versioning, testing of the, effectively the API, if you will, through to code snippet generation. There's business case, working on the, if you were from the old world and you had to deal with OIDs, mapping to URIs, URI construction, all sorts of great stuff that implementers need, and it's all happening over here. So that's my quick plug. I'm also the co-chair with your own from eHealth Ontario, but that's it. And we meet the fourth Wednesday of every month. That's it.